They called me Ethan back then, before the dust settled and the sharp edges of reality carved me into something else. 3 years. It's been 3 years since I rebuilt my life, brick by painful brick. Before that, I was Ethan, a lawyer, engaged to a woman named Claire. Claire, just saying the name feels like dredging up something toxic from the bottom of a stagnant well. We were the golden couple, Claire and I. Power lawyers, destined for partnership, a swanky apartment overlooking the city, maybe a weekend house in the Hamptons down the line. We'd been together 5 years. A slow, steady burn that felt like forever. Solid, comfortable, predictable. We knew each other's quirks, anticipated each other's moods. I genuinely believed she was the one. The year I proposed to Claire, though, the cracks started to show. It was supposed to be the happiest year of our lives, the start of a new chapter. Instead, it became the year the foundation crumbled. Claire lost her job. It wasn't a layoff, not exactly. It was messier than that. Something about bending the rules, skirting the ethical line. I won't get into the specifics, details I actively suppress even now. It was a confidential matter, settled out of court. But the long and short of it was, she was out, unceremoniously dumped by the firm. If you've ever known a type A personality, a hyperachiever whose entire identity is wrapped up in their career, you might understand the seismic impact this had on her. Work wasn't just a job for Claire, it was validation, purpose, a badge of honor. Losing it so abruptly shattered her world. She went into overdrive, of course. Applications flying out like frantic SOS signals. Networking lunches, awkward phone calls, endless cover letters. The problem was, her field was highly specialized. And the circumstances of her departure, well, they didn't exactly help. Days bled into weeks, weeks into agonizing months. No offers. Rejection emails piling up in her inbox. The confident, ambitious woman I knew was slowly dissolving into a nervous, anxious shadow. I tried to be supportive. Hell, I tried everything. Don't worry about the money, I told her. We're engaged. What's mine is yours. I saw it as my responsibility, my duty to shoulder the financial burden. I doubled down at work, taking on extra cases, pushing myself to the point of exhaustion. Knowing Claire's tendency to obsess, to drown herself in stress, I also tried to get her to relax. Take a break, I urged. Don't let this consume you. To my relief, she seemed to listen. Or at least, she pretended to. She decided to pursue something she'd always talked about, a long-forgotten creative spark, pottery. She enrolled in a local pottery class. Said it was therapeutic, a way to distress. I encouraged it. Anything to take her mind off things. That pottery class, that's where the rot truly set in. That's where my brother, Daniel, entered the picture. Daniel. My brother. My younger brother. He's always been my foil, my opposite in every conceivable way. Where I was the studious, responsible one, nose buried in books, focused on academics, Daniel was the charismatic rebel, the one who lived life on fast forward. He cruised through school with minimal effort, always landing on his feet. He was the life of every party, the guy everyone wanted to be around. A natural charmer, effortlessly popular. He was also a notorious player. A string of fleeting romances, never anything serious. He flitted from girl to girl like a butterfly, leaving a trail of broken hearts in his wake. Carefree, irresponsible, unreliable. Claire had met Daniel early in our relationship. She knew the kind of guy he was. So, when she started going to the same pottery class as him, I initially dismissed it as a coincidence. Harmless. Looking back, I want to kick myself. Hard. It started subtly. Daniel offered to give her rides to and from class. Just being neighborly, Ethan, he said with that infuriatingly innocent smile. Saving her some gas money, Claire would come home bubbling with stories about their pottery projects. showing me the misshapen bowls and lopsided vases they'd crafted. Daniel's got a real knack for it, she'd say, her eyes sparkling. He's so much more creative than you think. Then, the interactions extended beyond the pottery studio. Lunches, art museum visits, checking out new restaurants, activities Claire and I usually enjoyed together. But now she was doing them with Daniel. I started to feel uneasy, a low hum of anxiety that I couldn't quite shake. The change in Claire's behavior was undeniable. She was spending more and more time with Daniel, and less with me. Date nights were getting canceled. Excuses piling up like dirty laundry. So sorry, Ethan, something came up with Daniel and pottery. Gotta help him fix a kiln. I'm not the type to bottle things up. So one evening I confronted her. Point blank. Is there something going on between you and Daniel? She looked genuinely shocked, even offended. What? Don't be ridiculous, Ethan. He's like a little brother to me. She insisted their time together was purely platonic. He's just fun to be around, she said. He makes me laugh. You're always so serious. I wanted to believe her. I desperately wanted to believe her. For a moment, I even felt guilty for doubting her. But deep down, the unease lingered. The tension simmered, a slow, agonizing boil. 2 months before the wedding, I was working myself to the bone, juggling an insane workload, trying to ensure everything was in place financially. Ever since Claire lost her job, I'd taken on the full financial responsibility. Mortgage payments, utility bills, wedding expenses, it all fell on my shoulders. She hadn't found a new job yet, and while she used some of her savings for personal expenses, the bulk of the burden was mine. I was stretched thin, exhausted, stressed to the breaking point. Looking back, maybe that's what gave them the opportunity. My absence, my preoccupation. Maybe I wasn't paying enough attention. Maybe I was too trusting, too naive. One evening, I came home early from a business trip. I was looking forward to surprising Claire, spending some quality time with her. I had a bottle of champagne chilling in the fridge, a new movie I thought she'd like. As I pulled into the driveway, I saw Daniel's car, parked right outside our house. Normally, I wouldn't have thought anything of it. Daniel dropped by unannounced all the time. But this was different. It was late, past 9 p.m., and there was something off about the way his car was parked. I unlocked the front door, stepping inside quietly. The house was eerily silent. Then I heard it. Faint laughter, coming from inside. The living room was empty, but the TV was on, casting flickering shadows across the room. My eyes were drawn to the beer cans scattered on the coffee table. Then I saw it. Claire's clothes, lying in a crumpled heap on the floor. Her bra, her underwear. My stomach plummeted. A cold dread washed over me. I knew what I was about to walk into. A part of me wanted to turn around, run away, pretend I hadn't seen anything. But another part, the part that needed proof, the part that couldn't live with the ambiguity, pushed me forward. I walked slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. Each step felt like wading through thick mud. I reached the bedroom door and stopped. They were there, Claire and Daniel, tangled together in our bed, in the most intimate way imaginable. They were so absorbed in each other, so lost in their own world, they didn't even notice me standing there. Everything went white. The air seemed to thicken, making it hard to breathe. I'm usually a calm and collected person, analytical, rational, but this was a betrayal of the highest order. My fiancée, the woman I was supposed to marry, in my bed, with my own brother. Without saying a word, I stepped into the room, walked up to the bed, grabbed Daniel by the back of his neck. I yanked his face away from Claire's. The look of shock on his face was almost satisfying. He turned to me, his expression morphing from confusion to terror. I didn't even look at Claire. Daniel stammered, mumbled apologies, but his words were meaningless. I punched him, square in the nose. The sickening crunch of bone was a primal release. Blood gushed down his face. He cried out in pain. I hit him again and again. Each punch landed harder than the last. Blood splattered on the sheets, on the walls. He stumbled backward, his hands flailing weakly, trying to block me. But I kept going. He fell to the floor, a bloody, whimpering mess. Only then did I turn my attention to Claire. She was sitting on the bed, naked, trembling, sobbing. I looked her straight in the eyes. My voice was cold, measured. You have 10 minutes to get out of my house. If you're not gone by then, I added, I promise you'll be in worse shape than him. She started pleading, begging me to forgive her, saying she could explain, begging me to give her a chance to fix things. I wasn't interested in excuses. I glanced at my watch. 9 minutes left. The tone of my voice, the look in my eyes, must have convinced her. I wasn't bluffing. She scrambled off the bed, grabbed her clothes, started getting dressed. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely button her shirt. Tears streamed down her face as she grabbed a suitcase from the closet, frantically throwing clothes inside. When she was finally done, dragging her half-filled suitcase to the doorway, she turned to me one last time. Ethan, please, she sobbed. I love you. Just listen to me. Without a word, I reached for her hand, slid my engagement ring off her finger, pushed her toward the door. She tried to resist, pleading with me to reconsider. I opened the door, shoved her out into the night. She stumbled onto the porch, still crying, yelling for forgiveness. I didn't look back. I slammed the door shut in her face. Her sobs were muffled on the other side. Daniel was still lying on the floor, groaning, clutching his broken nose. He looked pathetic, but I didn't feel any sympathy. I was still seething with rage, but I knew I had to get him out of the house. I didn't want to be responsible for anything else. I called my parents, told them everything that had happened. My dad was furious at Daniel. My mom was shocked, speechless. They said they'd come over immediately. When they arrived, my mom, being a nurse, took charge of Daniel's injuries. She cleaned and bandaged his wounds. He was lucky, mostly superficial damage. Meanwhile, my dad pulled me outside, to the backyard, away from Daniel. He could see that my hands were still shaking, that I was barely holding it together. Son, he said, his voice low and concerned. Are you okay? I just shook my head, unable to speak. A few minutes later, Daniel came outside with my mom. His face was bruised, his nose bandaged, bloodstains still visible on his shirt. He approached me hesitantly. Ethan, I'm so sorry. I didn't say anything, just stared at him. He kept talking, stumbling over his words. I never meant for this to happen. It just happened. Then he dropped the bombshell. I'm in love with Claire. I finally turned to face him, my eyes burning with anger. He kept going, explaining how he believed Claire felt the same way about him. He claimed this was the first time they'd slept together, as if that somehow made it better. Then he pulled out his phone, showed me their text messages. Conversations filled with flirtatious banter, inside jokes, late-night confessions. Claire telling him how unhappy she was in our relationship. According to Daniel, she was the one who had invited him over that night. She thought I was still out of town. As I stood there, reading those messages, my rage boiled over again. Daniel kept talking, telling me how sorry he was, but also insisting he'd never felt this way about anyone before. He said he couldn't stop himself. He begged me to forgive him. His words were like daggers twisting in the wound. My dad, who had been listening quietly, finally had enough. He grabbed Daniel by the arm, pulling him away from me. That's enough, Daniel, he said, his voice stern. You've done enough damage. He scolded Daniel harshly, telling him how deeply he had wronged me, how ashamed he should be. My mom's reaction was different. Daniel had always been her favorite. I could see her struggling with the situation. Ethan, she said, her voice pleading. You need to forgive your brother. He's genuinely remorseful, as if that somehow lessened the betrayal. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Mom," I said, my voice sharp. "Don't even start. I'm not in the mood for lectures. I told my parents I just wanted them to take Daniel and leave." I couldn't bear to look at him any longer. My dad nodded, understanding I needed space. He helped Daniel to the car. My mom hesitated, clearly wanting to stay and mediate. But eventually, she followed them. The weeks that followed were a blur of anger, grief, and disbelief. Claire kept texting me incessantly, begging for forgiveness, trying to explain herself. Her explanations always circled back to the same tired excuses. She claimed she and Daniel never meant to hurt me, that it just happened. I mostly ignored her messages, deleted them without reading. Then, out of nowhere, I received a phone call from Daniel. He informed me that Claire was pregnant, and the baby was his. He actually had the audacity to ask for my blessing. My mother's reaction only made things worse. She had already been trying to play peacemaker between Daniel and me, but now she seemed to view Claire's pregnancy as some kind of divine intervention. "It's God's plan, Ethan," she said, her voice full of conviction. Maybe Daniel and Claire were always meant to be together. Her words were like a slap in the face. It was as if she was trying to justify the unconscionable, to excuse what they had done because it fit into her newfound fantasy of becoming a grandmother. I told my mother, in no uncertain terms, that I knew exactly what she was doing, and that if she chose to side with Daniel and Claire, our relationship was over. I wasn't bluffing. The betrayal by my brother was bad enough, but to have my own mother align herself with them, it was something I couldn't accept. My father tried to stay neutral, perhaps thinking it would help diffuse the tension, but his silence was just as damaging. My mother offered Claire financial support, assuring her that she and the baby would be well taken care of. Of course, there was a catch. My mother insisted that Daniel and Claire get married. After all, she couldn't countenance her grandchild being born out of wedlock. She was relentless in her pursuit of this outcome, refusing to even entertain any other idea. When I found out that Daniel and Claire were actually going to get married, that they had started sending out wedding invitations to our relatives, something inside me snapped. Without arguing further, I kept my word. I cut my mother and brother out of my life. My mom didn't give up easily. For weeks after the fallout, she called incessantly, left voicemails, even showed up at my doorstep uninvited, trying to guilt me into reconciliation. It was suffocating. That's when I knew the only way to escape her, to find any semblance of peace, was to leave. To start over? 3 years! It's been 3 years since I packed my bags, said goodbye to the only life I'd ever known, and moved to a new city. A fresh start. I changed my phone number, didn't share it with anyone except my dad. I made new friends, found a decent job, and slowly, painstakingly, rebuilt my life. I worked hard to bury the past, to leave it behind. So imagine my shock when I found Claire standing on my doorstep yesterday, ringing my doorbell. When I opened the door, I almost didn't recognize her. She looked nothing like the vibrant, ambitious woman I had once loved. Her clothes were shabby and worn, her face pale and gaunt. Her hair looked thin and unkempt. She stood there, clutching the hand of a little girl, a girl who couldn't have been more than 2 or 3 years old. The child had Daniel's sharp features, his eyes, his smile, an unmistakable resemblance. She was his daughter. For a moment, I was too stunned to speak. My mind raced, bombarded with questions. Why was she here? How did she find me? What did she want? The years I had spent trying to forget her, trying to erase the pain, seemed to collapse in an instant. Finally, I broke the silence. "Claire, what are you doing here?" Her eyes welled up with tears. Her voice was shaky. "Ethan, can I come in? I need to talk to you. It's important." My initial instinct was to say no, to slam the door in her face, to send her away. But then, I glanced at the little girl. She was staring up at me with wide, innocent eyes. I couldn't bring myself to be that cruel. I stepped aside, motioning for them to come in. I showed them to the living room, offered them water. Once they were settled, I sat across from them, steeling myself for what was to come. "What do you want, Claire?" I asked, my voice flat. I already knew she wouldn't have found me on her own. I hadn't given my address to anyone except my dad, and I trusted him, unless something truly important had come up. Instead of answering, Claire reached into her bag and pulled out an envelope. She handed it to me, without a word. I opened it, my hands trembling. I immediately recognized my mom's handwriting. My stomach turned as I read the contents of the letter. My mom had written, in no uncertain terms, that it was my responsibility to fix the mess Daniel had created. She laid out how Claire and the little girl, Jessie, were struggling, how Daniel had abandoned them, how, as Daniel's brother and Jessie's uncle, I should step up and take care of them. I looked up at Claire, confused and angry. "What is this supposed to mean?" I asked, holding up the letter. That's when Claire broke down and began to tell me the whole story. According to Claire, Daniel had always been unfaithful, even after Jessie was born. Affairs on and off throughout their entire marriage. Claire, for her part, had tried to make things work. For Jessie's sake, she had hoped things would get better, that Daniel would change. 3 months ago, he'd packed his bags and left. No explanation. No note. No warning. Just disappeared. Since then, Claire had been on her own. No job. No savings. No home. She and Daniel had been renting an apartment. Without his income, she couldn't afford to stay. My mom, feeling some sense of obligation because of Jessie, had been giving Claire money to support them. But now, with Daniel seemingly gone for good, my mom had decided she no longer wanted to be responsible. Claire went on to tell me that my mother wanted me to take care of her and Jessie, since they had nowhere to go and no one else to turn to. I was completely repulsed by what she was asking, by how ridiculous it was. My mom had not only sided with Daniel during the initial betrayal, but was now attempting to dump the consequences of his actions onto me. It was infuriating, but not surprising. My mother's relentless favoritism towards Daniel had always blinded her to the damage he caused. I told Claire, bluntly, in front of Jessie, that she had no right to expect any help from me. "This isn't my child," I said. "You're not my fiancé anymore. This isn't my responsibility." I did feel a pang of sympathy for Jessie, but not enough to override my anger. I wasn't going to be guilted into cleaning up Daniel's mess. I asked Claire to leave. She started to cry, said she had nowhere to go, no money, that she'd spent her last dime on gas to get here. I ended up giving her a few $100s before asking her to leave. Since then, even though I know I did the right thing, I can't help but feel a bit guilty, especially for Jessie. I feel sorry for that poor kid. Okay, so I would like to clarify a few things. My mom's behavior in this situation is completely baffling to me as well. The fact that she's trying to guilt me into helping Claire and her child after everything that's happened feels incredibly selfish. I get that she might feel obligated because of her grandchild, but she shouldn't expect me to clean up after her son's mess, especially after how she completely disregarded my feelings and sided with Daniel during the whole betrayal. Her request just feels even more out of line. I agree with some of your comments that my dad betrayed me also. Instead of offering the support I needed after the affair, he took a neutral stance. Although he did scold my brother that one time, he never really sided with me completely. By not challenging my mom's manipulative behavior, he also played a part in this betrayal. I plan on having a talk with him soon. Claire may have been left by Daniel, but that doesn't automatically put the responsibility on me to take care of her. She made choices, and even though I can feel some sympathy for her given the circumstances, I don't owe her anything. The fact that she showed up on my doorstep with nothing to offer but a sob story and a child only highlights her desperation. What I did, telling Claire to leave, giving her money but not offering to take on more responsibility, was an act of setting boundaries. I didn't shun her out of spite. I simply made it clear that it's not my job to fix what Daniel broke. I'm not obligated to take care of her just because she's in a tough spot now. No, that child is definitely not mine. Claire and I had already broken up weeks before she got pregnant, and by the time we ended things, we had stopped being intimate for quite some time. The timeline is clear, and there is absolutely no possibility that I'm the father. Moreover, Jessie has all of Daniel's features. Her face, her eyes, her smile. It's like looking at him as a child. There's no doubt in my mind that Daniel is her father. I don't need to get a paternity test done because the resemblance is unmistakable. The child is undoubtedly his, and I'm not going to be dragged into any more confusion. No, I do not want to adopt my niece. I can't believe some of you are even suggesting this. Regardless of Claire's financial or emotional situation, she is the mother, and it's her responsibility. I don't understand why she never worked after her marriage, or why she didn't save up. Daniel is the father, so even if they break up, both Claire and Daniel need to step up and take care of their child. Daniel has no option but to pay child support. I talked with my parents about everything. I already knew that my dad had given Claire my address, but I wanted to hear it from him directly. I called him and asked point blank why he agreed to share my location with her after I had repeatedly asked him not to do so, and what he expected me to do for Claire and her child after all these years. My dad was quiet for a moment, clearly uncomfortable. Then he sighed deeply and apologized. "I'm sorry, son," he said, his voice heavy with regret. "I really am. We've tried everything we could to help Claire, but with Daniel gone for so long, we could only do so much. Your mom begged me to give her your address. She said that maybe if you saw her after all this time, you'd want to help her out in some way, since she has nowhere else to go." I could feel my frustration rising. "And you thought this was a good idea? After everything that happened?" "We were desperate, Ethan," he pleaded. I asked him why he thought I would ever help someone like her. "She betrayed me with Daniel," I reminded him, my voice tight with controlled anger. "She hurt me, and now you want me to help her? To take care of her and my brother's child?" My dad told me he understood why I was upset. He explained that neither he nor my mom wanted things to turn out this way, but Claire and Jessie were family too. He said it was a complicated situation. He believed that I was their only option. "I'm sorry, Ethan. We hoped." His voice trailed off, weak and defeated. I interrupted him, my anger burning brighter with each word. "You betrayed me. You disregarded my feelings. You didn't respect my wishes. You knew how much I wanted to leave the past behind, and you dragged it right back into my life. And you had the audacity to do it behind my back." I told him that he and I were done. I had trusted him to be different than my mom, but it turns out that they are all the same, backstabbing traitors. Did they really think I was going to somehow forget the past and welcome Claire and my brother's child into my life and start taking care of them? Wow. My parents really did not care about me at all. I told my dad firmly, and without hesitation, that he should lose my number and forget I ever existed to him. Since he knew my address, I warned him that if either he or my mom ever showed up at my place, I would call the police. My dad attempted to apologize again, pleading for me to listen, but I wasn't interested anymore. "Don't call me again," I said, cutting him off. "Just don't. You made your choices, and I'm making mine." Without waiting for him to respond, I hung up the phone and immediately blocked his number. The finality of the gesture was stark and unsettling. What my dad has done is unforgivable, and there is no going back from this. It's been almost a month since my last update. Things have progressed in a way I never expected. I was finally able to track down Daniel. It took some digging, some favors from old contacts, but I managed it. Turns out Claire was right. Daniel has been living with his latest fling, a young woman a few towns away from home, pretending like he has no responsibilities, as if he has no family. He was living the carefree, irresponsible life he always had, oblivious to the chaos and pain he had left in his wake. I can't believe that this was the same guy who had told me, with a straight face, that he was in love with Claire 3 years ago. The same guy who had turned my life upside down. And now, after all of that, he was living with someone else, pretending as if he hadn't just abandoned his wife and child. It was infuriating, maddening even. How could someone be so selfish? So cold? The fact that he could be so casual about it, like abandoning his own flesh and blood was just a minor inconvenience, made me sick. After I found out where he was, I forwarded his address to Claire. I didn't want to get involved in any more of her drama, but I didn't want her to feel completely helpless either. So, I gave her one last piece of advice. You need to hire a lawyer and file for divorce and child support. Do it right now, before Daniel disappears somewhere else. I also sent her some money, just enough to get her by. Claire thanked me for everything. I could hear the relief in her voice. She apologized again, as she had already done so many times before, but I wasn't interested in hearing it anymore. I'm done, I texted her. Don't ever contact me again. Don't show up at my door. This is the last thing I'm doing for you. What we had, whatever it was long gone. Irretrievable. I just wanted her to not disturb my peace again, to let me finally move on, without the constant reminders of the pain she and Daniel had inflicted. I don't know what the future holds for Claire and Jesse. Hopefully, she'll get the child support she deserves. Hopefully, Daniel will finally face up to his responsibilities. But it's not my problem anymore. I've done what I can. I've set my boundaries. I've protected myself. Now it's time to focus on building my own future. A future free from the ghosts of the past. A future where I can finally find some peace. It's not a perfect ending. Maybe there aren't any perfect endings. But it's my ending, and that's all that matters. It is the only ending I could write for myself. A brutal but necessary cauterization to prevent the poison of the past from seeping further into my being. The silence finally is almost deafening. But in that silence, I can almost hear the faint, hopeful melody of a new beginning.